Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Hare Krishnas in Britain podcast. This is episode number 32. It's fantastic to have made it to the 32nd episode with you. We've had a huge selection and range of guests from around the UK and also on the rare occasion from outside the UK as well. Thank you to those of you who are tuning in on Facebook and to those of you tuning in on YouTube to watch it. I say this every week, but I really do mean it this week. This week, we have a really, really special guest because our guest this week is a disciple of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada, and he's the first disciple of Srila Prabhupada that has been able to come on this broadcast. So I'm really, really happy. It's great to welcome His Grace Mathura Prabhu. Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna to everybody and to you.
Thank you so much for coming on this broadcast this week. You and I actually think we first met many years ago. You might not remember. I think we have a mutual friend in Radhapriya, Mother Radhapriya, who is a god sister of yours, and I've known Radhapriya for well over a decade. In a previous life, I used to do community engagement work in the Bath area, and she saw that I was promoting in the newspaper that I had some money, not my money, that the council had some money to give away. So she rang me and said, "Oh, I want to build a temple in my garden. Do you think I could have some money for it?" So anyway, that I went down and I became friends with Radhapriya, and then I actually saw you at a kirtan event many years ago, but we've recently we're both quite close to Glastonbury, so we've kind of been around the Glastonbury scene to some extent in different ways. So I'm going to stop rambling. I'm so really genuinely really pleased to have Mathura Prabhu on the podcast this week. So Prabhuji, let's just start by telling us a bit about you and where you're from.
Okay, well, look, just to say thank you so much for inviting me on, and it's an honor, and I've done my whole series of my own podcast kind of thing, so I really enjoy it. And as everybody knows, I'm a big yapper and a big talker, so I can talk till the cows come home. And yeah, so a little bit about me. I mean, when one's telling a story, because this story is going to go, it's a personal thing about me, but it's a personal story specifically that's going to kind of take us through the Hare Krishna story, really, because this is the Hare Krishna Project podcast, which is one of the reasons why I want to be on it, because part of my research and my own book that I've worked on for years is about this story. And so I've had years and years of focus on it and awareness and reflection on the nuances and the subtleties of this whole story. So, of course, one of the main things about storytelling is these three things. I call them the three contextual pillars: time, the place, and circumstance, the individual. And so all the stories, and they can change all over the time, very rapidly. One minute you're in this dynamic and then you're in this, and you have to be very specific about what the person's going through, what are the influences happening. And my story all starts with I'm from actually southwest London, and only through talking to people in life about their stories, I suddenly realized how lucky I was with my upbringing, really, compared to some of the people, some of the traumas, some of the strange kind of like fundamentalist religious kind of upbringings that people went through. And, so when was I born? 1956. That makes me what's called a baby boomer, but not right in the thick of it, at the tail end of it. I mean, if you take the Beatles, for instance, who are the gurus of our generation, they're like 10 years older. They're all born at the end of the war, around that time. I'm born at the kind of mid to late 50s. My elder brother, he's 4 years older, 1952. He's a dragon. I'm a Chinese monkey. Even those 4 years makes a lot of difference. So there I am in southwest London. My father, born into a Jewish family, but actually an atheist and quite left-wing. And my mother from Sheffield, really, and they came down to London. So her parents, her father, who we call Pop, who lived to be 96. He had a thick Yorkshire accent, even though they moved down to London in the mid-20s. So I'm from that southwest London. If people aren't familiar with kind of southwest London, if you imagine the map of Greater London and the River Thames going through it, it flows through from the estuary, comes through the middle, and then you see the kind of circle of Greater London, and it drops down and does a loop. Now that loop at the bottom, as it curves down, that is called Hampton. And that's where I'm from. And there's a very famous place that's just there, and that's at Hampton Court, and that is the palace. And our English history is very much wound up with that place. And not only that, my school, because that palace was actually Cardinal Wolsey, who was in charge of the whole Catholic Church in England at that time. And he was showing Henry VIII around his new palace. And Cardinal Henry VIII said, "Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I think, what a great gift that you've given that to me." So Cardinal Wolsey was the founder of the school that I was going to go to, Hampton Grammar School in southwest London, founded in something. So it's not Eton or Harrow, it's a grammar school, but you can tell it's all kind of, like that. Not only that, that world that I was brought up in, it was Hampton Hill. It was like a village. Actually, my parents were this generation, they were in their 30s. My brother was 4 years older, so he went to the local school. They had their friends, their parents were all there. And my mum told me all about this. They actually had a group that used to come babysit for all of us, so the parents could go out and go to parties and things. So we had Auntie Eileen and this, and it was all kind of just not too far from a crossroads in Hampton Hill. And then not only that, we had Bushy Park, stretching all the way from Hampton Hill to Hampton Wick, and then from Hampton Court to Teddington, this massive open space in, because when you say you're from London, people imagine, the clock tower, the bridges, central London. No, we're talking about southwest London, where the River Thames gets rather pretty. And even I saw a documentary, the bit kind of Richmond and all that area, it's considered Arcadia. That's why other poets like Alexander Pope built their houses there. The great actor, what's his name, Garrick, right there in Hampton, he built his a temple to Shakespeare, and you could see scullers going by and swans, So I have to say, it's only when you leave these places you go, God, I was so lucky to be born in such a far out place with this. I could go out on my tricycle from my park to Bushy Park and play with deer around and things. I mean, God. So we were kind of in a city, but in the suburbs and not in the countryside, but not thick of it. That's the atmosphere. And very, very liberal compared with what I've heard with, I wouldn't, verging, not bohemian, but I would say liberal, because later on I met people with parents who were bohemian, that were, a bit more far out than conventional than mine. But, the interesting thing is I would have friends my age and going through a very different reality because of the parents that they had, all the brothers, So I had this 4-year-old brother, and shall I tell you how the biggest thing really, you can skip everything, but on the 7th of November, 1963, the day after my, the 4th of November, after my 7th birthday, the Beatles appeared on the Royal Variety performance. And I can almost define my life before that and after. And I say that that's not just me, that's a generational moment.
1963, you say?
1963, November the 4th. And my birthday's November the 3rd. I just turned 7. We were all, some of the neighbors, they didn't have televisions. I mean, it was the Royal, they were, and literally, it was like a lever being pulled. And this world that we'd come from, the 50s, the post-war smoggy 50s, kind of almost ended on that day, really. I mean, can you imagine? I'm at 7, at infant school, Stanley Road Infant School, the next day, everyone's just like, wow, Beatles, and within weeks, there was just, we were obsessed, basically. A few weeks later, the Beatles went to America and appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. 73 million people watched them there. So things at this time, you can't really kind of, without looking at one's life, you can't underestimate the value of this. And the fact, technology. the role that technology, without television at that time, at that place, these things wouldn't happen, you see. So, and then you get magazines. And also, if you know, all the documentaries on the 60s, until the 60s happened, there was no youth culture. People just used to wear the clothes that their parents did and the grandparents, but a smaller version. Suddenly there was Twiggy and fashion. Even my mum had Nova magazine, you know, and that was for housewives, and even that was trendy, you know. And you know, my parents were quite trendy compared to other people, you know. We used to go, you know, whatever, you know, because we had an art thing going on in our family. My mother's sister was an art teacher at Ham School, and one of my best presents was this thing of pastels, and my brother was always drawing, and my mum was good, and my father was a draftsman, an engineer, so there was a kind of art thing going on, and not slavishly cultural, you know. In the background, my parents had Louis Armstrong and jazz and stuff like that. My mum said her generation was Frank Sinatra, her younger sister, 7 years older, was Elvis, and our generation was the Beatles and the Stones. Then another thing about Southwest London is this school that I'm going to go to when I'm 11, after my 11 plus, Hampton School, founded by Cardinal Wolsey, is where the Yardbirds went, the rock group from the 60s. Not only that, Brian May from Queen, basically, they went to Hampton School. Not only that, in Twickenham, there was a place called Eel Pie Island, and there's documentaries on it, and you can see that the kind of music of the Stones and the Pretty Things and the Yardbirds, it all grew Southwest London. Twickenham Studios. Guess where the Beatles filmed Hard Day's Night? And it was, you know, there was something going on in that area. And I felt, not only that, you know, I was going to Carnaby Street with my brother. Not many of my friends had bright orange flares. I did, you know. I was a kind of, you know, I was a little kind of trendy kind of guy keeping up with things. Another thing with me, I'll just, you know, go and, you know, I was very good at sports. On the first sports day at infant school, I won the sprint by a long distance and instantly became like a super hit, not a super hit, but you know.
I was terrible at sport at school.
You see, yeah, everybody has, most of my friends were, but I wasn't. And so it's instantly people judge you by your physical prowess, you see. So even if you're rather naughty and mischievous and not brilliant, they go, oh, he's good at sport though, you know, let's guide him on that. So, and then I learned to swim when I was young. We had a swimming pool. So basically I became very good. When I actually took my 11 plus and passed and got to Hampton Grammar School, we moved from Hampton Hill to Hampton, opposite this horrible school. My whole life changed. That summer in 1968, we went from 67 listening to Sgt. Pepper's to 68 listening to Jimi Hendrix, If 6 Was 9. I was listening to this stuff when I was 11, and he's got in his kind of like chorus, I'm going to wave my freak flag high. And I'm listening to all this. And meanwhile, I'm joining the first year of this oppressive grammar school with my school satchel on, going into this world where it's got kind of soul crushing. But because I'm good at sport and my brother was a good rower, they tolerated me. So I went through all that. But my mother showed me the reports that I didn't know were there. So it gets each year to the fourth year. At the end, in the fourth year, it just says hopeless. Hopeless. I was hopeless, basically. So from being quite an intelligent child, I lost all enthusiasm for information and knowledge. It all became really quite depressing. And at the same time, I formed a little group with my friends who I'm still in contact with, you know. And this is where we became the little hippie rebels of our school, of our year. Okay. My brother, who was 4 years older, was one of 2 students of the National Students Union. So you can imagine grammar schools, oh, commies, oh, younger brother of a commie, you know, labeled, you know, like that. So, but sports, okay. But then started smoking marijuana. I actually started smoking cigarettes when I was about 9. I used to smoke 10 fags a day on my round. I was a naughty I was, you know, I was.
And how old were you when you started smoking marijuana?
13 and a half.
You remember it so precisely.
Oh yeah, I've looked at, you know, not only that, within 1 year, I'm taking the most powerful mind expanding drug ever kind of discovered, LSD. So I can remember, I saw you talking in another one, and I knew that this era is not your era, and you're not an expert at it, but I am a total, researched it in and out, and I might be name dropping certain characters and giving you an education, because it's all about what, the questions are, these are my backgrounds. And I suppose this question is kind of merging, I think, with the second, it's going to come, I think, because your question that you go.
Yeah, I can see where you're going with the story, if you like. Did you want me to ask the next question now?
Well, you just ask me anything where you
okay,
want to respond with what you've heard so
I mean,
far.
I was going to say, I don't want to make you feel old, because I don't want to make people feel old or feel young. My mother was born in 1963.
Right.
So she's just turned 59. She was 21 when she had me. So got your mic. There we go.
It was on a bit of a precarious.
Don't worry, it's the excitement of being on the podcast, being one of the on the Hare Krishna in Britain podcast. That's fascinating. And so we've kind of got then to 1970, and we're kind of moving into, at this point, get to 1970.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. This is not my era at all. Certainly, I wasn't in this body. I wasn't born then. I mean, I know a little bit about the era, but not a lot.
So, I painted a little bit of a picture about the younger bit, and then it shifts to this kind of like teen period with dissatisfaction with school and environment. But then when you look at the history, you suddenly realize millions of people were like me. It wasn't just me. It was a generation. I'm going through my journey, but there's a big generational thing going, and it's different for everybody, but similar. I
mean, I'm certainly aware that the 60s were kind of the sexual liberal revolution type decade. I was kind of thinking in my head about the Carry On films. Ironically, a lot of them were made in the 60s. They were made at Pinewood Studios, which I don't think is anywhere near southwest London. But the Carry On films,
well, it's a bit further out.
Even though they're a bit kind of quirky and slightly inappropriate now with the jokes, they really symbolized something in the 60s, didn't they? It was about we're having a film on and we're making these inappropriate comments, that it was about more of a revolutionary thing, about how you could behave around people.
Well, things in this whole kind of group generational thing, you see, I'm as a young kid, I'm in England, and I'm hearing this word hippie, which is, and I remember first hearing it, and I remember some friends of my mum's going, "Oh, the hippies." I just read that they had a kind of a procession in San Francisco. Meanwhile, I'm at home with my brother during this period. I'm kind of flipped back to 67 and that, because there's a huge, if you look at Beatles albums, you go Rubber Soul, Haircut, Marijuana. Then you go Rubber Soul, 66, not really out of it, but Turn Off Your Mind, Relax and Float Downstream. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, Timothy Leary. Psychedelic is coming into the Beatles. It's coming into the mainstream. And then you get Sgt. Pepper's. And if you look at movies like Monterey Pop, which were 1967, it's very important because all this story crosses over with the history of the Hare Krishna movement, which is what I'm going to connect, because just at that time, this thing was going on that was affecting. This was the time where Prabhupada was just entering into the thick of it in the beginning of January, beginning of the Summer of Love, with Allen Ginsberg, the kind of one of the gurus. And within a few days, he would be on the stage with him and all these rock groups. But anyway, my part of the story was I'm sitting at home watching Top of the Pops and Ready, Steady, Go. And this is how us as kids would see the haircuts, the fashion, and we didn't know what it was until Paul McCartney gave his famous interview and said, "You took LSD," and then the press are going, "Why are you talking about it?" He said, "Why are you interviewing me?" I didn't ask you to come. So suddenly someone like me has heard that Paul McCartney, my hero in the Beatles, has taken this thing. Before that, drugs were like Purple Hearts and things that Teddy Boys took. But the Beatles, and nobody knew what LSD was. It was so esoteric for an 11-year-old. But then I've studied the whole process of how did it come about that this thing spread through our generation. You can get into the politics of it because Nixon gets involved with it. By 67. You jump to 1968 and the Chicago trials and the Chicago riots. It wasn't just there, France, London. That generation from peace and love and everything, it was confrontational. There was battles. It was going on. That was what was happening. And then you jump to 69, Woodstock. 500,000 people in a, you know, so from a small little gathering, the whole thing had been growing and growing and growing. So in my world, that's what was happening at school and everywhere. Hair was getting longer. There was places to go. Marijuana was getting common. LSD was going through the underworld. And suddenly you're exposed to these things as a young kid. Basically, that was part of being a young hippie. Was what did you do with your friends? You went to your people came round to my house, because at my house I had mattresses on the floor, psychedelic posters, even, and we could smoke joints in my room away from my parents. They didn't bother. They didn't ever look in. And we would kind of like go through a journey, but it all went very, very, very quickly, really, because in the 4th year of my school, the headmaster called me into the room and said, Oleska, because that's my family name. Oleska, it's my Polish Jewish name. You either got to cut your hair, stop smoking pot and knuckle down, or don't come to school tomorrow. And I just went home and told my mum, and this was like May of the 4th year before I'd done my O levels, and she freaked out. It was, I think maybe she cried even. It was like her whole, you know, the parental nightmare of a wayward delinquent son, not even getting his bloody, getting the O levels yet. Then I had this fantastic thing. In 1970, this was 1972. In 71, there was this thing, the first Glastonbury Festival. Now, people I know in my area who were 1 year older, they'd all gone, and it was the event to go to. My friend Mary's elder brother helped put up that first pyramid stage. It wasn't the very first. 1970, there was a festival, but 71 was the pyramid festival where loads of people went. And you can see the movie of it. It's called Glastonbury Fair. It was very, very, very pivotal. And it was a hippie answer to what had happened with Woodstock and the Isle of Wight festival, that had started off as commercial events. And what happened, like in the Isle of Wight, you know, people started pulling down the fences. No, it's for the people. It was this thing where the underground and the hippie movement was being usurped by the music industry and for commercial things. Whereas in the whole Glastonbury thing started. It was peace, love, and come together and stuff. And so I wanted to, after I got kicked, I didn't go to school. And it was May, and I started working at the Hampton Court cafeteria to get a job. And I decided, solstice, 21st of June, I'm heading to Glastonbury. I don't know what's going to go on there. And I went with 2 friends, and that was very life-changing for me, because I got away from my suburban thing and ended up living in a field with about 30 hippies, because the farmer had just let us all stay in his garden, actually a garden with beautiful, it was lovely.
Which year was this? Which year was this?
72. This was the summer of 72.
So 50 years ago. 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
And so I was the youngest hippie, you know, but I had everything. I had, you know, bleached Levi jeans with purple velvet patches on them. I had a neckerchief. I looked, you know, people were, you know, that I looked cool, and I had a guitar, and I was okay. I could play blues and Beatles songs and jam. And there was one tent in this garden, which I called the tent of the vegetarian meditators. So you went in there, and these guys, there were 2 brothers, and they looked like Jesus. They had long hair and beards. And they sat in lotus positions, and they had Prinknash Abbey, beautiful frankincense, incense burning. And every time you went into that tent, the vibes were really good, and everything flowed nicely. And they liked me coming in, and then somebody showed me this book called The Politics of Ecstasy by Timothy Leary. So I didn't know who he was. I'd maybe heard his name. So when I got back to London after a week of this, something had happened. My mother, through some friends of the family, I don't know, a bit of name dropping, Galton and Simpson, the comedy duo who wrote, you were talking about the Carry On films, they wrote Hancock, and they wrote Steptoe and Son. They were a duo, and Ray Galton lived near Hampton Court, and his son and daughter knew friends of mine, and they got kicked out of their school and got accepted to Collin Park Comprehensive to do their O levels. And I went along and I did the same thing. I had to go from Hampton to Kensington. So that year, after coming back from Glastonbury, I went to that school. And this is where everything accelerates into another chapter in my life, from the spiritual thing, because we're going to get to the Krishna thing, really, because it was basically this book, because this repressive education, I'd kind of not read books. In fact, the only book I read was this very interesting book that my brother had called Play Power. And Play Power was by Richard Neville, who was the editor of the biggest underground magazine in England called Oz. And it was the first overview of the hippie movement. And funnily enough, I just talked about my brother and about this book. And he says, you know what? I never read it. And I said, that's the difference between you and me. I actually read it. And he said, yeah, I was more into the hippie style. And I suddenly saw about what counterculture, names like counterculture, things happening in names like what was Greenwich Village, Haight-Ashbury, the Provo activists in Amsterdam. I went, wow. You know the song, you know, if you're going to San Francisco, there's that cliche verse, you know, all across the nation, there's a strange vibration, people in motion, there's a new explanation for a new generation. This was like an anthem of, you know, a lot of it kind of went off to India. And we have to say George Harrison was the epitome of that. But we're not, I'm jumping ahead because Timothy Leary, I'm just going to give a synopsis, was one of the main promoters of psychedelics. And he, along with Richard Alpert, got kicked out of Harvard University for having what's called the psilocybin experiments. And many famous religionists like Dr. Houston Smith, their lives, they participated in these experiments when they were students, and their lives changed through taking psychedelics. And Timothy Leary got kicked out, and he wrote a bunch of books. One of them was the psychedelic, a translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is what John Lennon got hold of at Barry Miles's shop in London and wrote Tomorrow Never Knows from. You know, it was a psychedelic manual. So I started taking this LSD when I was a 14-and-a-half-year-old kid. And I had one of the very first things that happened to me was this, sitting in a restaurant in Richmond, L'Auberge, and I'm coming up on the LSD. My friends have nipped in to get a drink. I'm sitting on this table outside, and suddenly I come up onto this experience. And I'm looking down at my foot that seems miles away. And suddenly I start to panic a little bit because it's like, my foot, me, my, who, what, I did. Suddenly I'm in the middle of a whole existential identity crisis about who actually, what am I? And that's the beginning, I suppose. So I took these things at a very, most psychotherapists and psychologists say, oh, classic case, young teenager takes psychedelic drugs, gets deluded, ends up joining a cult, you know. so that's kind of what happened to many of us. And actually Dr. Stills and Judah, in his very first sociological book, the Hare Krishnas in America, I think, and the Counterculture, he said that of all over 90% of all the people he interviewed, early devotees, were all acid heads. We all were people whose lives changed dramatically after taking psychedelics. Not that necessarily we got the revelation on psychedelics, but just like me as a teenager, I suddenly like, who am I? It accelerated this process. So after getting this book, Politics of Ecstasy by Timothy Leary, what really changed me was there was a little chapter at the end of his book called The Poet of the Interior Journey. And it was all about Hermann Hesse, who I'd never heard of, you know. The only Hesse we'd heard of was the Nazi Hesse. And so it was like, oh, who's Hermann Hesse? And so next day at school, a girl had a little book, you know, and I could see Hesse. I said, oh, you're reading Hermann Hesse? She said, yeah. And she says, actually, I'll finish it tomorrow. You can have it. I said, wow. So this is how my life changed. It was like, you know, this was like a little window to the spiritual, whatever you want to call spiritual dimension. And this coincided with the talk with my cousin, who was a very literate and intelligent person, who my parents called over to have a talk with me to find out what was wrong with me, you know. And so he talked to me, said, you know, because my other name was Mark, he said, so Mark, tell me about life, what do you think? And he was sitting there with his beard. He's a, you know, Cambridge University, great literary person, and, you know, great hero of mine. And something came out of my mouth. This is around 15 at this time, and I said, I don't see life as a process of a kind of career opportunities. It's more about a kind of knowing and becoming more aware. I just said something like that, and I just went on for a bit. And he said, you know what? It occurred to me, and I said, what? He says, I think you're on a spiritual journey. And I went, spiritual? Nobody in our house talked about God, spiritual, nothing. It wasn't anything my parents talked about. There was a spiritist church in Hampton Hill. and it was, what weird things went on in there. So I didn't even know what the word spiritual was. So I thought, spiritual. So that's what happened. I just went Hermann Hesse, everything. And then what more? Oh, went into the school library, Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. Carlos Castaneda, other books, were coming out about shamanistic things. And then I read Aldous Huxley, and then I read the book by Tom Wolfe about the electric Kool-Aid acid test, about the other psychedelic guru, Ken Kesey, and he explained everything that had been going on with the Grateful Dead and the 60s thing and everything. Now, if you read Shama Sundar's book, he goes, Chasing Rhinos with the Swami, he's kind of really goes into detail about that, because he was in San Francisco and he's of the early baby boom generations, 10 years ahead of me. So he's part of all these kind of people. As I was a kid, I'm looking up to all of these people. What are they doing and what are they thinking? Now, Timothy Leary, who I just mentioned, his associate was called Richard Alpert. Now, Richard Alpert went off to India, met this Baba called Neem Karoli Baba, and came back and wrote this very famous book that really went everywhere called Be Here Now. And that book arrived just in the kind of, as I was just about taking my O-levels at Holland Park. And that's when I'd gone through this big journey, rapid journey, and I wanted, okay, I've got all this information, I've got to do something. So he has all these things that you can do, yoga, pranayam, a little bit of bhakti, and it's a kind of, he mixes it all up and gives you a whole thing. And I thought, oh, mantras, let's try a few mantras, and I had a friend called Bob the Beard who had this book. He was the only person near me, lived in a squat, who taught me my first yoga. So I started to do these things. I did a big mandala on my wall with a lotus thing, and I breathed and I saw in the middle, and I stopped listening to music with words. Even though I couldn't listen to the Beatles anymore, I just listened to far out stuff like John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Terry Riley, Rainbow in Curved Air, really weird, repetitive, meditative stuff, Tangerine Dream. So I just went really quickly into this whole new dimension. And then something interesting happened. I was walking around London with my friend, and we just went into this, what we thought was going to be some medieval movie, but it was Brother, Sun and Sister Moon, all about St. Francis of Assisi, made by Zeffirelli. And I literally had a religious experience in the cinema. Literally the first time I'd ever experienced something grace, or whatever you want to call it, because before this, God, no interest, spiritual, Christianity. I tell you what, a funny story. A few years before, standing in a graveyard with my friends in Hampton Hill, St. James's, and we're all sitting around, and two of my friends admitted that they prayed to God, and I went, I was so shocked that they actually even could consider it. And then I looked at the church, and I remember saying, I said, well, so what? Even if there is a God, so what? Why do they have to build all these things and do all these things? And what, let us get on with our lives. If he's created us. That was my kind of, I went from that kind of no interest to being obsessed, really. And that's why my parents were quite concerned, because they deliberately not exposed us to religion. Even my mother said later on, my father was suspicious of the Cubs, because we used to go on Sunday church parade. And he thought that maybe it was a neo-fascist organization, with all the khaki shorts and everything, So very kind of left-wing, different type of family. So I went from this, just to give an idea of this massive shift, and I supposedly kind of I've moved into the second question, which is really kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also conscious we have some photos to show as well.
Okay, do you want to do those before
if you want, we can just quickly go for the photos, and we can stop at a particular one, which is kind of linked with the second question. So let me just, I'm going to start with the first, sorry, hang on. I'm just going to share the screen. Now, that's actually photo number 2.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to let my device think for itself. Which it does sometimes take a while to do. This is photo number 1.
Yeah, well, look, you can see I'm a very young baby. And that's my lovely mother there. She was quite tall, and she was had a beautiful figure and very attractive lady. But you can also notice she's got a fag in her hand.
Yeah. Very liberal family.
Yeah.
Very
and
liberal
my granddad smoked a pipe. My mum even smoked cigars. So that's me sitting on my father's flat. That's my mother, and that's my mother's mother, and that's in their garden in New Malden. And I'm about 4, so it's about 1960.
Wow. This is a
That's
good
move
one.
on. This is like 1969. I'm about 11, 12, and this is me kind of posing, but this is the year of Woodstock, and I'm a little mini hippie.
Wow, great photo. I love that photo, by the way.
Me too. Me too. Now this is
Actually, so we can.
It's a little bit. We haven't quite got to this story yet, but let's keep that up there. This is where we're going. This is the next bit. This is
well. Let me ask you the second question now. Then, if you're happy to take it now. So we've got to the early 1970s in your story and your life. What attracted you to Krishna consciousness?
Okay, very good question. All this thing I've just been talking about, I was kind of so going, I wanted to know what it was all about. I was so eager. And this book, Be Here Now, it kind of set off a fantasy about kind of wanting to live with a group of people similar, because these things like people were living in squats, and I'd heard about communes and all, and I'd seen pictures of communes, but the whole idea of just kind of living in a commune just to kind of like live off the land was not enough for me. Now I wanted a combination, you see. There was also this group in England, you may not, not everyone talks about, but we talk about George Harrison getting into Krishna, but there was this group called Quintessence, and they kind of were really hippie English group, and they lived in kind of Notting Hill Gate. And one of the persons who's, Gopal, who did the albums, did the wonderful picture of Bhaktivedanta Manor in the temple room of Prabhupada, and he was part of that whole thing. So that was all. My brother had gone to Quintessence, so mantras were slightly there. So what happened to me was when I left that Holland Park school, and I'd had gone through this, reading all these books, I had some amazing thing happened. The first thing I did was go to a festival called Trentishoe Festival. And guess who were the first people I met? Some Hare Krishna devotees. And this is like just talking about July 1973 now, the beginning of the summer. And I went down with my friend Nick. And at that time, I was kind of like, oh yeah, mantras, okay. I couldn't really, it was like, what should, there's so many things on, I call it, the spiritual smorgasbord, available, should we go down a shamanistic route, a Taoist route, a Zen route? I mean, what's the difference? I wasn't quite sure, I bought the kind of basic, what I would call it, the, perennial philosophy of, that Aldous Huxley and people were, talking about that, we are spirit, we're trapped in the world. But what actually happens with the liberation aspect and what is the supreme, it was all the books were kind of quite impersonal and in the sense that they hadn't really gone in, they all got into the light. It was all about the light. Even Aldous Huxley's book Moksha, when he's guiding someone to die, it's all about the light. It's all inspired from Mahayana Buddhism, really. So I was kind of, though I met these Hare Krishna devotees, one of them was Charan Arvindam, and that night, just like they went on the stage and did the mantra, and it's the first time I actually got into them, because I'd actually seen devotees on a year before I got into the Indian stuff on Portobello Road, and they freaked me out. When I saw the kirtan party, I actually hid, because it was just, I was not quite there yet into appreciation of anything Eastern or spiritual. It kind of like, wow, that's really extreme. So Hare Krishna movement definitely wasn't immediate, you see. It was a whole thing I had to go through to get to that. And so what happened was, in a nutshell, we left this festival, me and my friend, and we got to a campsite, and we were both exploring spiritual things, and it had rained the night, and everything was dripping wet, and we were a bit miserable, but we talked ourselves philosophically up, and we said, we don't have to feel down. We can bring ourselves up through one of these spiritual things that we're into. And we said, let's try bhakti. So him and me, we both started singing, "Oh Happy Day," that gospel song. And then we went into, that led into "My Sweet Lord." And of course, "My Sweet Lord" led into Hare Krishna. And set that Hare Krishna didn't stop. That's where we just went with it. We just didn't get stopped with it. We just went on with it. And as we started to chant, everything started to change. We synchronistically, we kind of went out of this thing. We walked down the road. And we were both looking at each other as we were chanting Hare Krishna, wondering why this thing was doing what it was doing. And we got round a corner, and suddenly the sun kind of like shone out like biblical, and it was like, oh, and we just both, I've talked to my friend years later who didn't become a devotee, but he became very much into spiritual things. But it was a moment. So that was a big moment, that kind of, okay, there's this mantra, there's something going on with this mantra. Okay. But I didn't have the philosophy. I'd have to jump forward a couple of months. This is July. And in the process,
1974, did you say? Or
73.
73, July 73. Okay.
Yeah. So then I jumped forward, and I'd actually got 2 O levels and was allowed to enter into college. And I was all set up to go and do a foundation art course at Isleworth Polytechnic. But just before that, at the end of August, beginning of September, was the Windsor Free Festival in Windsor Park, the Royal Park. And not only that, that year in 73, as we all know historically, the devotees had just moved into Bhaktivedanta Manor that George Harrison had donated. Prabhupada had been there for a long time, longer than it ever been. And there were devotees there was a kind of electricity in England. And one of the main characters of this was Rebettinandan, who was the cousin of Vishnu Janswami, and he'd been sent by Prabhupada to England, and he had a big effect on devotees at that time in England, And I was at this festival with a whole bunch of friends of mine. We went there, and there's Creeper Moya. I know he joined after the 74 one next year. It was but 73, it started off violently. The police tried to stop the hippies, and we kind of had a fight, and we were too many, and they backed off. So this whole festival had lines of policemen at the end. And then over the night, we came in the afternoon, up in this clump of trees, thousands of people started to pour into this space, and it just became this massive thing. And guess who pulled up? Devotees. And they had a big van, and they had this big, amazing kind of exotic orange awning. It looked a bit like a Bedouin tent. And that night, I went into the kirtan with my friend, and we had a really great kirtan, But the next day, I did this thing. I'd been reading up about psychedelics so much that I realized they shouldn't be taken whimsically, but I did the thing that a lot of people do. And people take things under peer pressure. So all of my friends said, hey, we've all got some free, acid, take one, we're all taking it. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's, very small. It's very small, but within a short amount of time, I started to come up, and we all started heading down, and I started to go through what, is classically known as a bad trip. I actually started to get palpitations. My friends started mutating into monsters. It was absolutely hellish. And I had to get away, and I went away from everybody and just left everybody. Nobody knew where I went, and I escaped from everybody over a fence. I wanted to get away from all the noise and everything. And then I sat down, and I went into this very, very, very scary existential space. Very, very scary. But I kind of like, there was this one little bit of hope left, and I prayed and prayed and prayed. And I decided to get up, and I walked, and then I came around to the other side. And then there was this group, you may have, who were followers of Guru Maharaji. And I sat and watched them playing, and they had big, big pictures of him. The King of Kings has come, promoting him as an avatar and this. And they started to sing this really sickly song with a chorus that went, that's why we love Guru Maharaji. And I was sitting there, and I went, oh my God, this isn't it. This isn't it. Well, I was panicking. And then I suddenly saw, okay, the Christian tent is over there. You have to understand, I was in this really weird altered state. And I went over to where I'd gone the night before and sat down, because everyone was just sitting. And wow, as soon as I sat down and calmed my breathing, everything went into a better space. And they had this fantastic van with all these pictures of Krishna and Brahma flying on a swan, and the cowherd boys, and all this incense coming off. I think actually what happened was I ended up following the incense that was wafting down, because it was positive, and I ended up. And then just as I was getting settled, I heard this, And the devotee who was kind of holding the space said, oh, the devotees are coming back from the kirtan around the festival. And they burst into the tent with Robertananda and these devotees. And it was just mind-boggling what happened to me. It was like all the spiritual energy from the kirtan just kind of wafted over me, and all this paranoia and freak out just kind of washed away, basically. And to cut a long story short, I actually sat there like, I listened to, and do you know what the first thing Robertananda said was? God is not just light. And I just went, you're not meant to. Now inside I'm going, why is he saying that? Because everybody else is saying that. What is, and I was intrigued, but I was a bit disturbed, because what's he going to tell me next, and so he just went off on this talk, and basically in that 6 hours, I have to say, I downloaded the essence of Krishna consciousness. Everything in that 6 hour. It was a talk, then a kirtan, and then this, when I took the prasadam, I could feel it explode into ecstasy inside me, and I could feel it all over my body and going down to my toes.
Wow.
I just was going through, it was a total kind of shamanistic ego death rebirth thing, and I'm not even 17, and it's all just happening. I haven't planned this. I haven't woken up that day and say I'm going to have my life shattering experience this day, but this is what happened. And then he did, a talk, a kirtan prasadam, a talk, and I think I sat through 3 cycles, and then he was exhausted, and he gave over the talk to Robertananda, and he says, here in English, devotee, because he was a dude, man, Robertananda, he was this Californian guy who'd lived in communes and lived naked in trees, been in India. He was like, wow, dude, for a young, he's like somebody out of some amazing book, and he had real shakti. He was very articulate, and he was tuned in. That's all I can say. Some other incident went on at that time, but I won't discuss it now. It's in my story. There was an encounter with the Guru Maharaji follower, but it didn't bother me, basically.
Yeah, the Guru Maharaji devotees. I actually went to see Guru Maharaji about 8-9 years ago, when he how do I say this? He grew up and his name changed to Prem Rawat.
Yes.
And there's some followers of Prem Rawat in Bath, where I live, and there was an ashram here in the 80s. So I'm aware of that kind of community.
Yeah, no, that was it was very much a competition thing. We at that time, all over the world, Guru Maharaji and ISKCON were kind of really clashing, because they were both dealing to a similar, there were mostly people who had taken acid, and were kind of like, and later on it evolved into other different gurus like Osho and all these different people. But anyway, I won't get sidetracked with that. So basically then, the devotees were there at this festival for a few days. So it wasn't just a one-night thing. I could go, basically the next day I went straight back to the tent after I'd come down from the acid, and I just realized it was so deep. This wasn't just because of the psychedelics. This was kind of, wow, it went on a very deep level. So, and then of course there was this really weird thing, because I was meant to go to college, you see, and the phone call from Windsor Station, hi mum, hi, yeah, it was great. How was the festival? Yeah, really good. Yeah. Anyway, you got to Pat because college is on so and so. I said, yeah, but I kind of met these people. What people? I'll tell you all about. No, what people? Can you imagine? Freak out. And I didn't go home straight away, but when I did, it all started to get. I even had an experience like when I left the site, I learned the Maha Mantra on the guitar, and I was chanting it. And everything was fine as soon as I stopped chanting, everything went weird. It was I went through a really weird transit. Something happened during this period, very, very powerful with all of this, very quickly. And I also, the devotees had invited me to go to the manor. So I had these talks with my parents. I hadn't made up my mind. My mother actually had a very, very reasonable kind of thing. After it didn't happen straight away, but after I was really kind of threatening not to go to college, but to kind of follow this thing up more closely, she was like, why don't you go to college but still continue your pursuit in Hare, this Krishna? There's nothing wrong with that. Just do. And it was very reasonable, like my parents were. And I've often looked back at my life and thought, I wonder what I would should I have done that? Did I, because so that what happens is from this point on, this is, you're talking about the rapidity of what I'm going through. This is literally the first weeks of September 73. Then I have a very powerful dream as well with the Beatles and Prabhupada appearing in the dream and telling me to follow him and go to the manor. And I go to the manor, and just so happens Prabhupada had just gone to Stockholm and Sweden when I arrived, and he was off, but he came back. And then I had this whole experience. I went to the manor. I lived, and saw Prabhupada, had darshan, had these incredible, and then leading to the point where I actually, after a few days of being there, I offered my dandavats in Guru Puja, and in my mind, offered myself as his disciple, and but at this time, I have to kind of bring in this story. Just go back to my youth. Like, what is my nature? I discovered when I did my biography that when I went back and back, I never was, when I was a very, very young kid, maybe at 7 or 8, I thought there's something wrong everywhere. That, okay, my parents are adults, but I don't think they know either, and I'm going to go and find out what it's all about. It's this kind of theme in my life of being an investigative journalist of life. And what it's done is it's helped me kind of remain slightly going through it, but also standoffish as a voyeur, going, I'm going through this, but I'm keeping my eyes open at the same time. So when I went through to the manor, it was like, you can imagine, all these devotees were there, and devotees were coming from Europe because Prabhupada had been here, he'd been there and been in the Europe for a while, gone over to Stockholm, and he was going to go off to India, and maybe they wouldn't see him for ages because it was this big thing he did in that summer. So suddenly the manor became full of devotees. It was very, very exciting, but there was an incident that happened. And I was sitting, Hansa Dutta was there, who's the GBC, and it was a bit of a kind of realizing, okay, there's this far out thing there, but there's this institution as well. You see, there's two things going on in this story. There's the spiritual experiences, the connection with the essence of what this thing's about, and then there's the package around it, the institution which is formed around it, okay, with Prabhupada at the center. But then you realize that when you're going into the institution or connecting, you're actually, there's this illusion because everyone shaves their head and puts on the uniform that you're all the same. Everyone's the same, but actually it's not as easy as that. I realized just within a few days of being there, it was quite cliquey, especially in the manor. I noticed there was the kind of like the middle management who I likened to kind of, prefects at school, who were kind of a bit bolshy, and then you had the kind of people who didn't take everything so seriously. They were a little bit kind of like, a bit Jack the Lads, and things like, I found a few of them hanging out, and then you got the kind of maverick people like this famous guy called Christos, who everybody knew from that time, who'd been around devotees for years, and he was like Mr. Cynical. You don't have to chant 60 rounds because everybody's going to bloop anyway. It was like really weird. I was seeing all these different various people, and even in the japa room, if you would watch, the japa room was, oh my god, japa period, oh my goodness, it's like you've just kind of got used to this mantra thing, and then suddenly you're in this, you got some devotees go, people get in the corner of the ring, and then you had one devotee kind of sitting like Sanatan, who sat like a monk, cross-legged in the corner, head down, with his kind of hood over, and it was like, wow, another exciting moment. One thing was, I actually ended up going on a morning walk. Roberta Nandan, when he came back to the manor, saw me, and people said, that's one of the guys that joined from your thing, and I was sitting doing japa, and I felt this garland come over me, and it was Roberta Nandan, and he said, Prabhupada's going on a walk now, go on it. So I jumped out and I went on this morning walk. And part of the morning walk, when you went through Lechmore Heath, it was very covered with trees and dark. And then you came out of it and walked into this field. And suddenly it was so bright and you felt exposed, and Prabhupada turned around and looked at us. And then I suddenly realized, my goodness, he's very small, but he kind of looked and glanced at all of us, and I felt very demure. I could not kind of look him in the eyes, but as soon as he passed, I looked, and that was the first time I looked at him, and it was like, wow, is he really there? He's so exotic, and the aura, everything about him was like otherworldly, kind of so far out, really. And then of course we followed back, and then I saw the classes. I couldn't understand Prabhupada's accent. It was very, very thick, you know. So that's the beginning. That's the beginning. And what happened was after that was, I tell you what, what was very important. And when you look at your life and you realize what are the things that affected what you did, was one of the devotees who'd been actually the very first English devotee was called Kula Shaker. And he's very famous. And he joined, and when Shamasundar and Malati and Guru Das and everybody, and George Harrison, and he was there, and he had come from Amsterdam to see Prabhupada, and he had left a notice on the notice board saying, "Come to happy." Well, I'll tell you what it said afterwards, because they obviously didn't like the management that he'd put this up there, because he was recruiting for devotees to go to another place. So somebody had pulled it and thrown it on the ground, and this devotee called Sanatan had picked it up and put it in his bag. So after Prabhupada had gone and lots of people had left the manor, I was left in this kind of like quandary. What do I do? Because I like the Krishna conscious thing, but I'm not sure about the manner. I'm not really sure. So I was saying, is there any other places I can go? Is there anything? And, I told him my reasons. And he said, he got out of his bag this little book, a bit of paper, crumpled bit of paper. And it said on the top, "Come to Happy Amsterdam Temple, where the devotees smile at you." And then at that very moment, I knew
I love that.
my destiny lay. I am going to Amsterdam. It was like, yeah, life has sent me the answer. I don't have to think anymore. And that's what happened. And I have to say that was a divinely inspired thing, because what happened in the next part of the journey, where that photograph is going to come in, this is basically what happened. Was when I decided to go from England and go to this center in Amsterdam. There, this is literally June 74. So when I actually left home was actually October the 12th, 73.
It's amazing how you remember all of this.
No, these are crucial. The dates and everything are very, very important, because try to understand that whole experience at the Winter Festival was like first week of September. We're only talking about the 11th of October. That's like 6 weeks. Now, I'm just going to say something special, because there was one defining experience that happened to me that was one of the big things in my life, which is kind of, okay, it's a lesson to be learned about Krishna consciousness and the institution which surrounds it, or the movement, and to differentiate what those two different things, they are intricately linked, but they are defined. So I was going so deeply into Krishna consciousness at this time, intensely, because I just figured, I downloaded it. Yes, God, Krishna's God. I was reading Bhagavad Gita on the way. I got a job working at the Coty factory in Brentford, doing destroying to get the money to go to Amsterdam, basically.
Yeah.
I had this job where I had to destroy reject bottles. It was awful. I had to have a mask because of the fumes coming from and it was crunching. Can you imagine crunching glass? But I was chanting the Maha Mantra, and something happened while I was doing it. This is all I could describe. And this is while I was chanting, suddenly the chanting expanded out like an ocean, and I had to stop everything I was doing, and I started to palpitate, and I started to feel ecstasy, basically bliss. And I couldn't chant Krishna's name anymore. I was going through, and I was, and I started even remembering St. Francis from Brother Sun and Sister Moon, walking out and looking at the mosaic of Christ and what he was, I just went off into this state for about 20 minutes. I went off into the state, standing in the Coty factory. It came as mysterious. It went as mysteriously as it came. And what I call it is grace or revelation. And to tell you, if I'm quite honest, I actually considered that my Diksha.
Wow, amazing.
Before I got, because I've read Prabhupada said, when you actually accept and adopt Krishna consciousness, that's your Diksha. The actual initiation thing is just what you call it, not a ritual, it's a
form. Formality.
Formality, thank you.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
right word, yes. So this is just me, this is me telling my story,
Yeah.
my thing. I'm not trying to convince, because I've talked to, not everybody has these types of experiences, really, and well, they do, maybe they do, but I've had this type of experience has happened to me only about 4 times in my life. And they've been the crucial things that make me realize I actually have a relationship with God. This is my inner spiritual relationship connection with God. This is why. So in my mind, I still hadn't joined the temple, you see. So in my mind, all the, and I still could have gone to college, but it was like, well, look, if what I've just experienced is at the core of everything, because up till now, yeah, you got this, we all say Krishna consciousness, Prabhupada says it's a science. You've got this theory, And I was going, okay, that's a great theory. Okay, let's adopt it. I'll adopt the practice of chanting Hare Krishna, thinking Krishna all the time, see what happens. I was so into it. And then this happens and I go, wow. If that's what's at the core of it, okay, I am prepared now to go into whatever it is, because somehow or other, whatever this thing is, because I'm still not sure about this package of this institution, at the core of it is this thing. And this is I touched home base of Satchitananda, what the very idea of eternity, knowledge and bliss. I just got some little fragment of ecstasy of that, my spiritual nature and what is actually the spiritual dimension, way beyond anything I've experienced on psychedelics or pot or anything. It was, whatever, and that kind of experience kept me going for years. And so, to that picture that you've got shared.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that I actually got the name Mathura. So when I went to Amsterdam, that place that Kula Shaker said with the devotees, it was actually, it's funny. I arrived that day, the night before, stayed at some people's houses. They gave me a lift in the morning and I went down the Betanienstraat, this little street, and they all joked because it was right in the thick of the red light district, okay? And I went down this little street, the Betanienstraat, and I couldn't see the temple. I started to go into panic. Oh my God, where is it? What's happened? And then this one hippie came out of a house where there was a big marijuana barn going in the pot. I just arrived in Amsterdam. It was another world. And I said, I thought the Hare Krishna temple's there. He says, yeah, it's that garage. And I went, oh yeah, they'd actually painted newly. If you see an older picture, you'll see Sri Radhakrishna temple, but they'd whitewashed it so you couldn't see it. And so I stood outside the door of it. It was like a door of a garage. And I went, oh God, what have I done? What have I done? What have I done? And I knocked on the door. And then this devotee opened the door with this massive smile and said, Hare Krishna. And I said, wow. I said, I'm Mark. I wrote the letter because I thought, he said, I'm coming. And he went, oh, Mark from London, Hare Krishna. Well, and I went from total despair to I'm there with, and this building was actually the very first building that Surabi, who was Surabi Swami, who was the designer of the Krishna Balaram temple, the Bombay temple, Hyderabad temple, Mayapur. They're called the Kailman brothers. Hank Kailman was Hare Krishnas, and he was. Hans, I think he's Hans, is Surabi. And then there was another brother, Jagadev. And then Surabi's wife was being Kishori, and she was the first one. She was like my cooking guru. She's an incredible character. She lives in France. Amazing lady. So she joined, and Surabi, before he actually joined the Hare Krishna movement, designed the interior of this garage. And it was like a TARDIS. You go in and there was this entry, but then you go in and it was just lit, all these arches and painted pink and stuff, and then there was an altar, and you can see there's pictures of where Prabhupada came there and they installed Jagannath there, and there's walks with him walking around Vondel Park. There's even a video that's gone missing mysteriously that I and Vimukta Sangha got to see, made by some early video freaks, which actually shows them coming down this bumpy road, speaking in Dutch about the Hare Krishna leaders there, and they walk in and it's full of, and then there's Prabhupada and he's angry. We were going to call it the anger of the pure devotee because everything's so spaced out. It's quite anyway. That was that center. That was one summer before I arrived. That was 72 that happened, and I'm joining now in October 73. So Yeah, please.
So can I ask a question? Just kind of want to maybe move along a bit and talk about, so you're kind of having doubts a little bit about the institution of what the nature or the purpose of an institution is.
Yeah.
And I think eventually, maybe obviously eventually Prabhupada left around November 1977. You were still active at that time in ISKCON throughout the 70s?
Oh, yeah. I was there when Prabhupada passed. I actually observed it. But let's get to that. That's kind of a little bit jumping the gun.
That's fine.
Because that photograph that you placed there, that is the beginning. Okay. So what, the journey that you go through by joining the Hare Krishna movement at that time, this is important: time, place, circumstance. Okay, who's the circumstance? It's me. The place, Amsterdam. The time, 73, 74. It's very important, because I could have been in Frankfurt, I could have been in Paris, and had gone through a very different dynamic with different types of people and different things. I became really immediately aware that there was politics in the Krishna movement, because Kulashekar, that devotee, he had an enmity with Hansadutta, as well as Tulsidas, who was Tulsidas, who had been a very successful manager in Los Angeles, and Kulashekar had brought him there. He was the temple president. Kulashekar was extremely dynamic, and not only that, we had Patitu Dharan, who you might know as Mathura twins on astrology. These were all incredible devotees in this small little center, and they all disliked Hansadutta. There was and my very dear friend Vimukta Sangha, who's still my dear friend, he'd just been poached by Kulashekar to come to Amsterdam. He was 2 years older than me, and I became kind of really sussed and aware about what the hell was going on. Not only that, the very second week I was there, a guy from Sri Lanka, who I looked like a devotee with a shaved head, he ran away with a whole bunch of money. He did, and it's just like, woo. And suddenly you realize not everybody's there for the same reason. Everyone, so you've joined a cast of thousands, an international thing. This is what happened when you joined the Hare Krishna. And in those days, it wasn't like it is obviously now. I'm trying to paint a picture. There was no kind of big community or anything. There was these small little centers with very die-hard people that were doing, we had cold showers, in a small little shower. We all lived on the floor in these really kind of austere conditions, but we had fantastic prasadam. Like Amsterdam, we had these incredible cooks, and when I joined that winter time, you get Govardhan Puja and all of these different things. So we then moved. This era that I joined in was October to February 74. Suddenly everything changed. We got this amazing building on the Heringgracht, that means the gracht of the gentleman, and one of these classic Dutch buildings, like 4 stories high. Suddenly we talk about moving up, and this is so when I joined at this very specific period where ISKCON went through a massive explosion all over the world. You had this initial thing in America, then it spread to Europe, and then it went through, and a lot of it was to do with having the right facilities, having the right buildings, having the whatever, So we moved. A lot of the work was getting that building ready. We all moved over it. And unfortunately, the guitar I had got ripped off, so I didn't have my guitar anymore. When we were moving from the healing grass, somebody from the battalion, somebody picked it up. So then, we'd been there a couple of months. You see, it's a little bit like there's a time in everybody's life, son. I had one of these talks from the Sankirtan boys. About 4 of them got sick. Suddenly there was, who was going to bring in the money? Who was going to collect now that they were sick? So they called me in a room, gave me Maha, and said, look, we just need you to go on Sankirtan for 1 week, because I did have issues. I didn't mind being a Hare Krishna, but I still had a big issue about going on the street, because even the guy who taught me yoga, he said, the Hare Krishnas are all right, but they're a bit hustly. They want to talk to you about God, but the next thing they want to sell you this, they want to do this, they want to convert you. And I just thought, I'm not into that. I think that's one of the negative images of a Hare Krishna, and one of the negative things that I had of Hare Krishna was how they looked. They didn't look elegant. They used to wear like orange Marks and Spencer's nylon anoraks, you know, and you know, it's just like really aesthetically uncool, you know. It's just like, at least, you know, like traditional Tibetan monks wear kind of whatever. It was a whole big, being a Hare Krishna, going out in public, chanting Hare Krishna in a temple, cleaning pots, doing this, that's fine, maybe doing Harinam, but going up to people, selling a book, that was another level. But guess what? I was out there. I started in Amsterdam, and guess who I met on my very first day in Den Haag? Dennis Hopper from Easy Rider, who was an Easy Rider with Peter Fonda on the motorbikes, the Harley Davidson. I met him on the street. It made my day, and it kind of went, okay, maybe I can handle it. Maybe there's some little thing. So I ended up doing that for 2 years. But there's something very crucial in this story about what happened, because up until this moment, Hare Krishna and Krishna fundraising was quite sattvic. What you know, it's because we have to look at what are those terms: sattva, rajas, and tamas. You know, this is my theory. Okay,
You're allowed to have your own theories.
Yes, sattva is all about, you don't get immediate results. It's like organic farming, you know, versus fertilizers. You know, you might impress yourself with a few years with, put some fertilizer, everything grows, but then after a couple of years, all the ground and everything gets depleted, you know. So and you know, that's rajasic, the difference between sattva and rajas. Things kind of like look very, very, you get great results. So what happened with us? Okay, at the beginning we were all wearing dhotis and going, oh, Hare Krishna, you know, selling, you know, enough, just, you know, a group of us, die hard, we're getting enough, you know, where else were the funds coming? A little bit of money from spiritual sky incense, that's it, you know. And so then what happened? We went into this thing called records. Okay, it started with Hans Duta producing a record in Germany, and they found out in Germany that they could sell records easier than books, and the records cost little to print, and you could get a good donation and then give out a book.
So which year was this, by the way, the
74.
record? So that when Prabhupada was still around,
oh yes,
there was a move from selling books to selling records.
Yes, not just records, but records were introduced. And then this is Europe. You got to go over to America to see what was happening. I'm going to bring this in now as well, because not only that, we were getting cassettes from America. I don't, you know, Trivarari, Pragosh, a couple of people, they were actually explaining quite immoral things about how to do quick changing, how to do, it was all kind of very, I was always a bit suspicious, because everything being very American top heavy. Basically, everything was being managed by Americans. Everything, all the top positions were Americans, theories from America, because they were and Europeans in our own culture were kind of second-class citizens. That was a little bit of the gripe that Kulashekar had with Hansaduta. But anyway, so I used to find it quite difficult selling records and books, you know, a lot. I was okay, you know, but what was great was the team. You had this kind of team thing where there was like 4 of you and you became very close and you stayed, and it was kind of very, you know, people will talk about this who went on this, and it was very austere, but there was a kind of a camaraderie about it all, you know, and we were like Prabhupada's, you know, out on the front line, you know, kind of doing this thing. But then so I remember, but there was what happened was Mahavidya, who was Italian and kind of one of the leaders of the Sankirtan in Benelux, which was Holland and Belgium. He went to Germany for this big meeting because we were still under Hansaduta. And Alanath, who later became Paramandwaita Swami, they come up with this whole thing, and they had a sales mantra to go with this new concept with the records. Now, Mahavijay, I remember the whole thing. He came back, we had a meeting, and he described the meeting, and this is where we're going now with this new thing. We're going to have these records, and we started off with one record, and then the president of Amsterdam, he actually produced an album with Mani Banda, basically, another devotee, and it was called the India album. And it had songs from Achyutananda Swami on it and some other people, other devotees. And it had quite explicit pictures of devotees in India feeding people in India. It was designed to get donations, okay, to follow a specific narrative, okay. Now, we had two records. We had these book bags that were everybody had a book bag, quite heavy. Many devotees have suffered back problems for the rest of their life from carrying these massive bags, but they were records, and you had maybe records on one side, books on another, quite heavy, you know. Now we was, you know, when you're getting up in the morning at 4 o'clock, having a cold shower, doing a whole bunch of sadhana, even before you've had breakfast and go on the street, the level of, you know, you seem to, it's you're kind of, you've developed your psychic and mental focus to a point which is much beyond the average person. You're following some very, very strict focused lifestyle that's kind of extraordinary, really. It's only back later you realize, oh my God, how focused we were, how pure we were, you know. I mean, we were all celibate, you know, we're not even losing our semen and things like that. We're like really got Shakti. So on that first day, we used to like Belgium better than Holland. We used to like to use the word pious, but actually really what it was gullible. The Dutch were a bit more savvy, a bit more different. So we went to Belgium. They were pious and nice and friendly. And we went to one of these funny little villages near the border. And not only did we have the records and the mantra to sell them, we had a change of identity. Gone with the dhotis, on with the kami clothes, you know. So after being a devotee for all this time, this is the first time I'm putting on civvies, you know, and not hippie civvies, very straight kind of civvies, you know, straight trousers, straight looking, ordinary, with a hat on. We haven't got into wigs yet. We graduated into wigs, you know. Everybody needs to know this story because it's like, well, what was it like in the Hare Krishna movement? Because this is going to lead to other, it's a development of something that's happening in a movement I joined up for because of a mystical core thing, but now I'm engaged in a thing, you know. I become part of the community. I'm a fundraiser. I'm doing what Prabhupada wants, apparently distributing the literature, but we're now changed our tactics. We're kind of being slightly devious with our, you know, we're not being full on. So I'll give you I'll try and say a little bit of what the mantra was. In Dutch, it sounded like, Guten Dag, alstublieft, neem het mee, we hebben in Monica, komen zo terug van India. We geven ze plaats to alle mensen today. You have the good heart. That means we're monks, we've just come back from India, we're giving out these records today. Please take one and give a kleine bijdrage for helping the kinderen in India. You know, that was so you can understand in English. Basically, what's happened is we've gone to telling not untruths, but white lies. Because, you know, some money was going towards a trust that Prabhupada had set up to feed children, but not all. This became a big issue. You can maybe look up later exactly all of the issue about this, but it's quite a big thing. So, but the amazing thing was that this, and our leader said, look, if they don't understand what you're saying, just get the mantra, have it written on a bit of paper and show it to the people, because this mantra is so powerful, it will have this effect. And it did. It was amazing. I kind of went down this nondescript street, knocked on a door, went in, and I think the second one people didn't understand, and I just showed them, and they went, ah! They pulled up the till and gave me some money. And I went, thank you. And I gave them the record and the book. And by the time we met up at midday after doing the morning, I had never, ever achieved what I had done that day. I'd sold all of the records. My money bag was just bulging with money. And then not only that, everybody who'd been doing that had a similar type of result. So you can imagine from that, it's a bit like the Beatles, you know, suddenly something changes on a day. On that day, the financial and expansive modus operandi of the ISKCON movement changed in our world, okay? So being a part of the Hare Krishna movement meant that you said, actually, I don't think this is quite good. I don't want to do this. This is not very good, immoral. We're telling little fibs. Or you just jumped in like we all did on groups, like, you know, we all compromised a little bit I believe, with our integrity. This is what I believe. Now, everybody will say that Yukta Vairagya, offering all the fruits to Krishna, but I think that there's something wound up with all of that. Because what happened was that building that we had in Amsterdam, not only did it cost quite a lot of money to rent, but it had to do this. And then around 75, which was amazing, Prabhupada just translated Chaitanya Charitamrita, and it arrived en masse in golden books in Amsterdam. And we were installing Gaunitai deities. So we went from just having, and they'd spent a lot of time building this beautiful altar. And Paravida Prabhu was the Pujari. He can tell you all sorts of stories about this crucial time, because within a few years we went from Jagannath to Gaur-Nitai and then Radha Gopinath. Now, so you've got economic concerns, and then you've got to create a bunch of devotees who've got sacred threads, because without devotees who've got Gayatri, you can't cook the offerings and you can't do the pujas, you know. And then at the same time, everything's growing. More and more people are joining, the building's getting bigger, you know. So that's the environment that I was in, okay? And then what happened was, I became very good at it, and I collected quite a lot of money. And I mean, I could go on and on, tell you the amazing stories, getting into the European Common Market building in Brussels, and going into the Irish thing, and the lady about to give me money, and then hearing the thing, and then armed guards with guns. How did you get in here? What are you doing? What are you? And when you tell them you're a Hare Krishna, you know. So funny, humorous, weird things. We did strange things to kind of like do what we do. Devotees were very...
Hare Krishna, are you still there? So we seem to be having some technical difficulties. Mathura Prabhu has frozen or disappeared. So we're just going to wait for a minute or so just to see if he returns. It may be that he has to leave the Zoom and then return again. So fascinating story so far. Okay, Mathura has left, and we'll see if he returns. But fascinating story so far of his experiences in the Hare Krishna movement in the 1960s and 70s. We've seen some of his photos. I always knew from devotees that have told me a lot about Mathura Prabhu that he has a fascinating story to tell. We're just waiting to see if he dials back in. You know, it's fascinating, the photo that we saw just now of Prabhupada with the Catholic missionary or the Catholic priest. I never knew until Mathura Prabhu showed me that was actually a picture of himself. Just waiting to see if he logs back in. Of course, the West Country, where Mathura is also residing near to myself, has had a lot of storm damage recently. So maybe there's been some issues in rural Somerset. Thanks to everyone who continues to tune into these podcasts. We've got some fantastic guests coming up as well over the next few weeks. We've got kind of a waiting list of guests at the moment, from devotees from different parts of the UK who want to be involved. I'm just seeing if Mathura Prabhu is online. See if he's going to come back into the broadcast. This is the first for the Hare Krishna project. Yeah, just to remind you, the Hare Krishnas in Britain podcast is brought to you by the Hare Krishna project. It's an initiative that's been going for about a year now, and we've got devotees from across the UK that are getting involved with the initiative from different walks of life. And we're providing kind of a space for devotees to get together and chat, share resources, share ideas, including Mathura Prabhu, who were waiting to make a return. You know what he mentioned, Prabhuji mentioned Hampton. I always think of Henry VIII because of, I think Henry VIII resided there, because I drive around or near Hampton a lot in southwest London, and I often do think of Henry VIII because he resided there. So just waiting to see. I've messaged Mathura Prabhu to see if here he is. He's coming back into the room. Here we go. Hey, here he is. He's just connecting to his audio. I've been filling the space I don't know if you can hear me. I've been filling the space as you went. Don't worry about it.
But
Yeah,
do you know what happened? My computer, the battery is weird. And when I did that thing, my power thing went out. And so I've had to redo.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
Okay.
We're still here. We're still recording. I mean, it wasn't as long as you felt it was. I was just filling in the gap with some things.
Fantastic.
I mean, I'm just conscious of the time as well. We've been
Okay, I'll
broadcasting
try and speed it up a little bit in the journey, because during this whole process as an individual, I'm individuating. I'm growing older. Look, I joined when I was so young, you know. But then suddenly when the Chaitanya Charitamrita came out, it was the first book that I really got into.
Yeah.
I never actually I read the Gita before I joined. Bhagavatam wasn't really into, but Chaitanya Charitamrita turned me on. I was the only person in the temple. And just at that time, Achyutananda in India had been making these recordings. So I was getting used to the tambura, the sound of the tambura. And India, I am one of those devotees that was more attracted. I wanted to get to the roots. This is a big thing about my story. A lot of devotees don't really identify that much with the whole Indian part of it. I totally was. In fact, at the art, I actually liked all the Indian posters in a sense, and the pictures, the aesthetics and everything more. I just really loved more Indian-y stuff, you know. So, you know, the time is, you know, and then 76 came, and as a reward for being good boys, we all got sent to India for the 76 Mayapur Festival. It was incredible because two other God brothers had gone for the 75 one. And, you know, ISKCON is expanding at this time. You know, Krishna Balaram Temple was opened in 65. Then the long building in Mayapur wasn't even built in 76. So we all went to, when I arrived in India, in Mayapur, I went, oh my God, this is it. This is my home, the Bengal, you know. I was just like so into being there. So when I came back from that festival, you know, which was a couple of weeks in Mayapur and a couple of weeks in Vrindavan, I got a bit sick. My whole mode as a Sankirtan, rushing on the street, doing it, changed. And then not only that, we had this fantastic summer of 76. And Lochanananda, who was the new president, he really wanted, I'd said, look, I want to come back to the temple. I just can't do Sankirtan anymore. I'm clashing with Mahavi, you know, one of the leaders. So I came back and we had this fantastic summer. One of the best years of my Krishna conscious life was the summer of 76, going to Vondel Park, which was like a non-stop hippie festival, and us cooking halava, going with the thing, a madras on, sitting on the floor, picture of Radha and Krishna. I cooked the halva, and Vasutama and I would play mridanga. And people would come over, this musician would come over with a saxophone, people would come over, dancers. It was just every day, fantastic experience. People coming to the temple. It was very colorful. I felt very, very much at home. But then we had the installation of Radha Gopinath. And then Prabhupada started to get weak, you see. And somehow or other, I was always desiring to get back to India again, but I didn't have a pretext for it. But then one of my friends, close friends, he said, why don't you come and join the library party? The library party was this amazing idea that Prabhupada had started in America with devotees going to colleges, meeting educated people and selling sets of books to libraries. And Gargamuni, who was the brother of Brahmananda, early devotee, had set up the Indian version of that. And my friend was part of it. And he said, come and do that. And on that kind of pretext, plus a few others, Bhagavan, who was now the new GBC, I hadn't even mentioned that we'd had a change of GBC. I also glossed over the fact that we had a real nightmare period for 6 months with Pretu as the president. I almost left. It was awful. So I've experienced schisms in the movement, different quiet thing, you know, like experiences where you just kind of like, you realize that being a Hare Krishna devotee wasn't just having Prabhupada as your guru, being connected to the Bhagavan. It means being in a group of people that you never knew who you were getting involved with, you know, especially, you know. So I went off to India, basically at the about 77 in the end of the monsoon, around September. And it just so happened that I happened to be in Bombay. Prabhupada made his last visit to the West and then came back to Bombay, and I happened to be in Bombay then. And I actually chanted. The only time I've been in a room with just Prabhupada was with me and my friend just chanting for Prabhupada. And I did have a very negative experience with somebody. I'm not going to talk about it, but it was so awful that it made me one of the big leaders in ISKCON. And with Prabhupada, it really, really made me go. I'd never had any confrontations with anybody of that height, because in Amsterdam, we didn't have many sannyasis coming through or people like that, Bhagavan, we didn't have those kind of things that were happening in different parts of the world. But then I encountered some personalities and I thought, like that, and Upendra, who was Prabhupada's servant, was coming over to our rooms and telling us all about what was going on, and we were getting backstories about the certain personalities. Oh, I'm trying to be diplomatic about now. So and then, to cut a long story short, I ended up being in Vrindavan when Prabhupada passed, basically. And I've described that for people who are watching. I've done a series of talks where I really explain in deeply that experience. You can watch it. I think it's in number 18 of my videos.
I'll put a link to your YouTube channel.
And there you can go. I can go into details, actually, what happened. What was interesting, though, was after Prabhupada had been placed in his samadhi, there was Bhakti Chiru and Satsarup. And I just remember saying, so what do you think is going to happen now? This was November the 14th, 15th. And they said, well, we don't know. We'll just have to wait till the Mayapur festival. So you had November, December, January, 4 months away. Nobody really knew what was going to happen to the Hare Krishna movement. Nobody knew. So I then had a very nice few months, really, and again, some of the best time of my Krishna conscious career, traveling with a group of devotees around Gujarat, just 4 of us in a van, talking to professors, selling Prabhupada's books, until it was the time to go right from the western part of India, Gujarat, right over to the east, overland. I'd never done it before. So we had to get the vehicle fixed for days for the long journey in Ahmedabad. And I went with my friend up to Nathadwar. Nathadwar is a very important place in the Krishna story thing. It's where the deity that Madhavendra Puri installed, it's mentioned in Chaitanya Charitamrita, was called Gopal, was installed in Govardhan. But then somehow the Vallabha Sampradaya took hold of the worship. And during the Islamic period, a lot of the deities left Rajasthan and left Vrindavan and went to Rajasthan. So one of them was Nathadwar. Now, why? I didn't just want to go there to have darshan. One of the reasons was one of the famous art paintings that everybody's seen for years is this famous picture of Krishna called Murli Manohar. It's one of the best-selling prints ever made in the world. And it was done by this very humble Vaishnava called Narottam Narayan. And we know that because he wrote it on the bottom. Narottam Narayan, Nai Hawali Nathadwar. It meant nothing to me as a 17-year-old. Suddenly my friend said, let's go to hey, that's the place where hey, I'm coming. So I met Narottam Narayan, the person who did that picture. There's a very famous picture you can see. I haven't got a picture of me with him, but there's one with Ramdas, Abhi Ramdas, who just passed away, and Pushkar. They went to visit. I actually was the first, but I went off and did my research into I was being pushed to kind of explore Indian aesthetics. Where's it coming from? This was the beginning. So I went there, we went overland, and then we came to, I don't know if I'm going to describe this whole incident that happened in Mayapur. Do you want me to describe an incident that actually happened on the very first Guru Puja?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. On the way before I got to Mayapur in 78, for this, thing where the whole Krishna movement was going to change, we stopped off in Puri. I'd never been to Puri before. And on there's a temple of the Gaudiya Math that was where Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was born, because Bhaktivinoda Thakur lived there, and there's a Gaudiya Math there. And there's an Assamese devotee that Prabhupada, he wanted to join ISKCON, and Prabhupada said, no, you please don't leave your mutt, but whenever Western devotees come, show them Puri. So he did. He took us all around all the places, Siddhu Bakul, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya's house, got us prasadam, and he told us amazing anecdotes, one of which was about Krishnadas Babaji. Now, I'd seen Krishnadas Babaji at Prabhupada's passing, along with Narayan Maharaj, and I was obsessed at looking at him, because I'd heard that Prabhupada said that he was a Paramahamsa, you see. And, when Prabhupada said that, then you really, and I was watching him that night when Prabhupada's body was on the, Vyasasan and Narayan Maharaj was there with brahmacharis, and Krishnadas Babaji was playing Mridanga. I watched him, observed him a lot. And so then I get to Puri and I hear this amazing story. It's a very famous story that this Krishnadas Babaji used to chant. He went on a Purushuram, a very long brat, to chant non-stop Hare Krishna and not eat and sleep for days. And the devotees got very concerned about him because he was getting weaker. So they called a doctor, and the doctor put his stethoscope to his heart, and he heard the Maha Mantra coming from his heart and fell down on his feet. So I just heard this amazing anecdote about this great personality, and I come to Mayapur. Okay. Okay, I'm going to tell these things that happened because you want to know why I left and disaffected. This is one of the reasons. Okay. We'd had this library party, everyone was happy, but after Prabhupada had left, Gargamuni, who was one of the very first devotees in New York with Brahmananda, his brother, very close, he disappeared. So the leader of the library party wasn't there, you know. And the rumor was that Tamal Krishna had already decided that he wanted to take over the library party, and nobody wanted him. We actually wanted to have Swarup Damodar from Manipur because he was an academic and more in tune with kind of like what we were doing, you know, and a nicer, softer personality. And so we were all in the long building. We had this meeting and we sent Abhinandan, our representative, over to tell Tamal Krishna the bad news that we didn't want him as our leader. Unfortunately, we could hear screaming and shouting from across from this Lotus building at Tamal Krishna, screaming at him. And when he came back, he had his head and he said, no, it didn't work, you know. And anyway, we had this really awful meeting on the night of the Purnim that year. We're in Bhavananda's room, where all of the library people were brought into the room and told that we had all been poisoned, like Gargamuni, who was poisoned. And that we were all, and everyone was looking at each other going, what the hell is this going on, you know? And then they had this next day, they had the Guru Puja, okay, where they all, so what happened was, and you may not have heard this before because not many people witnessed it, but what actually happened was, on this actual day of all of the 11 gurus, they formed little seats all around Prabhupada and had their disciples perform aratis to them, their potential disciples. And this puja was started to happen. And it divided the devotees into most of the devotees were all, yeah, the new gurus, you know, they're all around this scene. And there was other people like me who were like, what's going on? What is this? And I kind of distanced myself away from it while it was going on. Just at this moment, this puja was going on. At that time during Gaur Purnima, what happens is the various Gaudiya Maths go down Bhaktisiddhanta Swami Road, which is, because that, you know, it's all Gaudiya Maths, various Gaudiya Maths. So all the other Goswamis are mostly all over in Navadvip. So on that road, so they take their muratis, they're on a palanquin, and they go, and they all come down, they come into each other's mutts. It's quite festive. So just as that was going in, suddenly we hear Bengali devotees in the palanquin coming into the temple room. And one of the doors is Pradyumna, the scholar, the academic, called Panditji, who knew Krishnadas Babaji very, very well from years. So suddenly out of this crowd, Krishnadas Babaji emerged and ran over to Pradyumna, who saw him and was going like this. And I was watching all this, the Guru Puja of all the people, the Gaudiya Math coming in, Pradyumna calling Krishnadas Babaji. And as soon as I saw Krishnadas Babaji, you know, I've seen him, I've just heard this amazing anecdote. Me and this other devotee, we rush over to touch Krishnadas Babaji's feet. And do you know what he does? He goes, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. And he runs away to get away from us when we tried to touch his feet. So I'm not going to say anymore, but that is a very powerful experience. Okay. I'm not, you know, I've described the scene. Okay. So this is what you're talking about. Suddenly we've gone into a new era. Now, if you look at history, when regimes change, political, religious, it's a big, massive thing. I mean, I was even reading about Alexander the Great, and we think he's so great, but he just basically killed all of his father's ministers and got rid of all of them and established all of his team. And it goes on and on and on. So this was just the beginning. This was just the very beginning of me observing something, and it started to grow. Okay. Now, what happened was I decided I don't want to be part of the library party. Now Vimukta Sangha, my friend, was the president, and he said, come back to Amsterdam, you know. So I thought, oh, yeah, it's time to come back to Amsterdam. So suddenly I go back to Amsterdam after having 6 months, 7 months in India, library party, watching Prabhupada, kind of quite free, and then coming back to this, suddenly the new order. So at this time, Bhagavan was a Grihasta. Okay, there was only 2 Grihasta gurus left who were of the 11 gurus, Jayatirtha and Bhagavan. Now, Bhagavan, on his first visit to Amsterdam, before he came, me and Vimukta Sangha, we create, up until this time, nobody had anything special. You know, people, if a Swami or somebody came, they slept down in the office, but they slept on their sleeping bag on the floor. There was no special facilities given to anybody or anything. Suddenly, we were making a nice room for the new guru of this, whatever this meant, because nobody knew. It hadn't even been established what that meant. So he came and we did a really nice, we painted it, decorated, made it really good. And he was very happy, Bhagavan, with what we did. Very nice. It was a kind of nice thing. He was very mellow, but everything changed. Okay, very rapidly, because anyway, I won't get into all the details. He went over to India with Tamal Krishna, and Tamal Krishna Goswami gave him sannyas. And then he came back. And when he came back, because this is really what it was like to be a Prabhupada disciple at this time. Okay, you try to understand why people.
This was late 70s. You're talking 79.
This is no. This is right after the 78 Mayapur festival. They'd just been made. Prabhupada had left in 77.
Yeah.
Right, in November 14th. We've just gone a few months, come to the Mayapur festival in 78. Now they were all officially declared gurus, 11, who, I won't get into the whole story, but they were declared gurus. How that was going to be interpreted and applied is another story. Nobody knew that yet. So Bhagavan came on that first visit. We did the room. He went away, and then he went and got sannyas. Now, when he came back, it was, it's in my tape, it's in my book. Basically, it was like he was completely changed. He walked with an artificial swagger, a Napoleonic tilt of his head, and he was playing a game, the guru game, He suddenly switched he'd gone from being this kind of quite libertine, liberal, mellow grihasta, like a guru, kind of a leader, who had children and a wife and everything, to suddenly taking on this thing from somebody I really didn't like. I'm not going to get into that, but that's also very important in the scheme of what happened and who were the characters that manipulated things. And so that's the beginning of what happened. And it was, I think I need a BMW. Jaguar's not quite good, the Jag's not. And do you know what? When I was writing this, because I was the Mr. Interior Design. I'd done the interior design. Oh, I didn't even tell you about we opened the restaurant in Amsterdam before I went off to India. The first Govindas in Europe, me and Vimukta Sangha. I missed out on that one. That was a one. So I did all the interiors with Vimukta on that. People knew I had taste. I knew how to do things. I'd done his room. So I was in charge. Now, while we were buying stuff for Bhagavan during this period for his new room, because it was like, okay, got to expand that. The women who were over in the Ash, they've got to move over to the other building on the Kaisersgracht. I moved upstairs to this funky little room that I had that was brilliant. It was my saving grace. It had a joke called the Krishna Kata room. No other brahmachari had these kind of facilities except me. And I got away with it because Vimukta Sangha, who was the president, was my friend. But I had this room. And anyway, I did Bhagavan's room. And there was this kind of like chair. It's like trying to choose a chair for him to sit in to greet guests. There was the desk and the guru seat, and then there was the other chair. And I saw this really quite vulgar, over the top kind of Louis XIV, but I thought it was nice color greens and everything. And I remember getting carried away with being a kind of, here I am encouraging him to kind of like, with ostentatiousness, by presenting it to him and tempting him with the offer of these things, and at the same time thinking, absolutely, this is really nuts, but actually I am getting a buzz because I enjoy spending money and buying things. So I was conflicted in this, at this moment, doing this, and then it all led to a confrontation. Basically, I could go into all the details. I'd actually started to learn tabla from a disciple of Ravi Shankar, a sitar player at this time. So I used to cook the British. I tell you what was the actual crucial thing that broke the camel's back with this issue was while this was going on and Bhagavan's room was being developed, he took up another small little room while it was happening. And he called me in there. And I my thing was, one of the things I did was lead Guru Puja in the temple in the morning as part of the rituals. I did a good Guru Puja, but now it was two things going. There was Prabhupada, and then there was him, and there was his disciples. And he had adopted this name called Gurudev, even though he was Bhagavan. Somehow they got this name Gurudev. So he called me into the room, and I could tell he was a little bit nervous. He could tell he had been thinking about how to broach the subject with me. You see, hi, he kind of said, hi, hi, Mathura, just want to have a little talk. Look, everybody loves your guru. Praise me. He's a good psychologist. Everybody does that, but for the sake of my disciples, do you think that you could chant my name in the Guru Puja? And you could see that I wasn't enthusiastic. I was not really jumping on it with it. And so, and I was going, I'll try, kind of. So I think I tried it twice, tried it. And if I'm quite honest, it left a bad taste at the back of my throat. And that was when I started retreating, because that wasn't it. He'd spend the time there everywhere. There was no lectures of Prabhupada anywhere. It was all Gurudev, 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 Gurudev. So suddenly within weeks, I was a member of a movement where Prabhupada was the guru. And now I'm suddenly in a thing where the institution's gone and all the lectures about Guru, 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 Guru. And it's not Prabhupada, it's him. They're asserting their authority. This is what it was, the experience. Now, all over ISKCON, this was happening in different degrees, and gradually it started to kind of like freak out Prabhupada disciples, because what had happened, there was a huge backlog of disciples that hadn't got initiated by Prabhupada that were waiting for initiation. So they all became initiated by the gurus. There was quite a lot of them, and some people, conspiracy theories that this was all a whole plan done by people, and that's why So this is what was going. So, when you live in a group and a community, it's like you have cronies and people who are followers, or you have people who are in the middle. My friend, he was kind of stuck in the middle because he was my friend, he was a manager. We all got on. I got on with Bhagavan, temperamental as a temperament, but there was this thing going on that was very, very hard for me, till it all climaxed in a confrontation where he called us down into the room. Oh my God, this is me, naughty boy. You can hear my story at school, getting kicked out, headmaster. Here's another authority figure. I'm up in my room above his, and I've started listening to Indian music at this period. I've started getting really into Ravi Shankar, classical Indian music. I'm individuating really bigly into all the stuff I'm into, which is, nowadays people say, yeah, what's the problem? But in those days it was so you were either in or out, and so one day Bhagavan sent up his servant from downstairs up these stairs to our room and says, Bhagavan says you should turn off the music. It's he said Gurudev, and I made some cynical thing. I said, Gurudev, it's not my Gurudev, and we all went, Gurudev, like that, us old Prabhupada disciples. It was very risque. So he went down and told him what had happened. And so we were all summoned down to his room. And he made this big mistake, and he apologized, I have to say, afterwards about this, in front of his disciples and people who were kind of more part of the system. All the people that were upstairs, there was a couple of disciples who had come from India there. He got on everyone's case a little bit, and they all went, yes, Maharaj, no, Maharaj. And then he saved me for last, Mathura. I went, yeah. And he went through this. He said something that really pissed me off, about Ravi Shankar, and I didn't agree with him. He did a Prabhupada said, and my thing was, this is all part of Indian culture.
I hear that a lot now in ISKCON. People use Prabhupada's words for certain justifications to suit their own needs.
It's very, very much, and every time he said something, I would actually. So he's surrounded in the room. You have to imagine it's quite crowded, and it's all. And look, I've been in this temple for ages. Everyone likes me. I'm a Mr. Nice Guy. At Mathura, I used to go on Sankirtan. I'm friendly. Everybody knows me. Suddenly, I'm this confrontational anti-establishment devotee suddenly, kind of like, what's happening? So I counted something. He said, and then I did it twice. He said, he screamed, "Don't butt me," because I went but. Yeah, that's okay, but don't. In other words, I just shut up, So then what had happened was this devotee, Ravi, who you might know, Ravi Das from Leicester, it's lovely. He always in Stroud now. He was friends with Prabhu Vishnu, and he had come over collecting money, and he was the one that told me about Bangladesh. They were getting this money to get these cars to take over to Bangladesh, and you could hear Raga Kirtan. And I went, Raga Kirtan? The two things I was mostly into, lovely traditional kirtan and raga, and they had it in Bangladesh. Not only that, my friend Chanarari was there, and I was like, I'm out of here. So in this meeting, I said, actually, I'm making plans. I'm going to be leaving. I'm going overland with these guys. And he kind of said, when are you going? Give him the money. They just wanted to get rid. After being this loyal devotee. So what happened was, in my story, this is a very interesting section of my story. I go from confrontation, amazing adventure overland with Krishna devotees during the time of the Iranian Revolution. We entered into Iran on the 19th of January, the day when Ayatollah Khomeini returned back to Iran after being is what you call it. He was in Paris, exile. He was in exile in Paris. And it was a whole, the timing. And then I ended up going overland with this van to Bangladesh. And suddenly I was in the most pristine part of the world where actually original Gaudiya culture is from, more in even East Bengal than West Bengal. And I've described this, and this was like, oh my God, my experience, the people I met there. We stayed with one Vaishnava called Nikunja Bihari Goswami and Raj Sahi. And there was just three of us, me, Rasika, a New Zealand devotee, and Mahakratu, who passed away recently. And those were some of the most incredible. So I went from confrontation, adventure to wow, and that gave me a lot of faith in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Okay, in general, because I saw the pristine culture, how it was, what it was like at the roots level. And I went, okay, I think I'm not into this exclusive rights business, Then I got sick, came back to England, went over to see Bhagavan at one of his big birthday bashes in New Mayapur, which are outrageous. If you ever see a video, you'll go, oh my God, is that what it was like? My friend took a whole video of the whole thing. It was just so over the top. But Bhagavan liked me, you see, and he said, don't go back to Bangladesh, be my man in India, because these artists do things. And so what happened was, I was in Antwerp, and Mrigapati was setting up a preaching center there. So I went there, went to Antwerp to collect money to go back to India. And I designed all of Mrigapati's thing, I could get it all for him in India. So I went off to India and had this fantastic period in 79 of traveling by myself. Nobody, no library party. I took off my saffron cloth when I arrived. I started to wear white. I stopped shaving my head and having a little hair and just being a free agent, and it was fantastic.
So you were a brahmachari, or you were certainly wearing saffron at some point?
Up to this moment, I'd worn saffron all this time, know. And my sexuality was ambiguous. I wasn't really sure where I was going. I was considering marrying. There was this wonderful man called Major Chanda who had joined at Mayapur, who was a retired major who'd been a disciple of Amir Khan, one of the great vocalists. He had a daughter. Even Jai Pataka said, he was the one, I met Jai Pataka in Bangalore on my travels, and he said, maybe her. And so I didn't know what I was meant to do, really, and where I was meant to go, how I was meant to make this shift from, being a brahmachari to whatever I was going to go. But what happened was, I was kind of based in Bombay, but they didn't like it because I wasn't under them. I was, they couldn't pin me down.
Mm.
And, they had this fantastic facility, the Bhakti Kalakshetra, that I should have been part of. And I was going to be with, putting on drama and artistic things. I wanted to work with B.G. Sharma, Indra Sharma, great artists. They could do paintings and all these different things. But I went off, I spent most of my time traveling. I was getting stuff for this preaching center. I got it still exists. It's now in Radhadesh. I got Shankeda furniture from Gujarat, beautiful lacquered furniture. It all got sent by.
I've been to Radhadesh twice.
Okay.
Yeah, amazing
So
place.
I got these paintings I went all the way to Orissa, got some paintings of Hanuman, Garuda, Radha Krishna. I was off. I was doing my thing. I was designing and getting into Indian art I didn't miss not being with anybody. I liked my own company. And I found that I had really great results when I just met people on my own power. I met the top singers in India. Pandit Jasraj, went to his house in Bombay, knocked on the door, became friends, went to a private gig, met S.M. Pandit, this very, very famous artist. B.G. Sharma, became very close with him.
So you helped set up what we now know as today as Radhadesh.
Well, basically, I actually discovered it with okay. At that period,
you keep revealing these things in your story. It's like, wow, you've done all these things,
Well, when I say discovered it, what was happening was that building, the Healing Grat, which was incredible, it had a limited lease on it, and the temple, everyone had grown so much, the whole movement, and they needed to get a new place, and so they needed me. Rana Durmada, Mrigapati, and Vimukta Sangha were a group. We had a car, and we were getting all these addresses sent to us by estate agents. So we started in Holland, going to, monasteries, schools. We were trying to find places in the country that were, like in case there was a nuclear war. Nobody was really thinking about going environmentally green and stuff, but they certainly, it would be great if we had some farming land and stuff. So then we started looking down in Belgium. We saw some incredible places, like fairy tale castles with moats over them, and but they weren't practical. And then so one day we went down to this place in Septon, and we were waiting, and it was incredible when we were with the estate agent and us group, and then suddenly we were waiting for the owner in this, it was like out of James Bond movie or something. This Lotus Elan car kind of pulls into the thing, and this guy jumps out with these leather boots on, Serge, and he's the owner, and he's this dude, and he owned it. And anyway, when we went in and looked around, when we went down the stairs and saw the kitchen, I said, come on, this is it. You've got walk-in fridges, you've got all these things. This is the practical building. And it was, but I left kind of, I was just part of that preliminary group. I actually kind of almost moved out of ISKCON when they started moving into it, and actually took months for them to actually move in. But I was actually, the first 4 devotees to actually see Radhadesh. Basically.
Wow. So I'm kind of conscious of the time. We've been chatting for 2 hours, which is fantastic. We've set a new record for the longest ever podcast, which is great, which is fine. So we one of the questions I have for you was about kind of what made you in the end leave the institution that you were part of, and you've answered that in so many ways. And I've
just got one anecdote, but carry on.
I mean, I feel maybe I should invite you onto another podcast later on to talk about yourself today, quite possibly.
I could sum it all up quite quickly
if you want to, or we could do another edition later on. I mean,
well, it's up to you. Well, you see, this thing that I went, the straw that broke the camel's back in this whole story was actually on this trip in '79. I was spending more time in Calcutta because I started to do research on kirtan and kirtanias. I was on a search. This is what my search was, that this tradition that we belong to, the musical tradition, was rooted, it was all connected with classical music somehow, but nobody could explain it or why. But the one person could, and that was Santosh Das, an American devotee who's actually goes by that. He's called Guy Beck. He's a professor, and he's written lots of books. He's a fantastic intellectual and knowledgeable. He met me in Calcutta, showed me this book, Historical Development of Indian Music by Swami Pragyanananda, and there was a whole chapter about Narottam Das, the Ketari festival in Bangladesh, how he'd learned Drupad music with Shamananda and Srinivas for 7 years when they went to Vrindavan, took all the literatures back to Bengal, had this fantastic festival at Ketari where Janavi Devi was there. It was the first big thing when all the Vaishnavas came together, Gaudiya followers of Mahaprabhu, and that's this, you know, basically, without going too much long, I discovered, yes, our tradition is a cultured tradition with a musical tradition that's based on classical aesthetics and so on and so forth. So during this time, I got into a conflict in Mayapur with Bhavananda, and who was there. And in a conversation, I happened to imply that he wasn't a Paramahamsa. And he basically, in a nutshell, I won't get into all of the details because we were running out of time, but it led to him going to Calcutta and telling the devotees not to let me stay there because I was poisoned. Because I wasn't part of their gang and part of their plan, and I was doing my own research into stuff that they just didn't want. So basically that led me, that was in a February. I had 2 months. Then I had a conversation with Bhagavan where we met up in Bombay, and we had this long conversation. And in that conversation, I had been thinking for 2 months, going through turmoil about what I'm meant to do with my life now. How can I live in this movement? It's not what I signed up to be. It's becoming something else. He doesn't know where it's going. And so I had this discussion with Bhagavan, who, by the way, in Mayapur, after I went to Bangladesh, he apologized to me and said, I'm very sorry about how I dealt with you in Amsterdam. It was, you know, wasn't correct. You know, he apologized. I you know, took my hat off for him for that. Didn't stop him from being a maniac, egomaniac later. But anyway, at least with me personally, I had a good rap. And in that conversation in Bombay, while I was talking with him, I went through this thing. I think that ISKCON is suffering a kind of identity crisis. It doesn't know what it is, because I've heard very different versions of what it's meant to be. You know, from it's a preaching movement. We're making Vaishnavas, we're making Brahmanas, we're Sankirtan movement, we're Varnashram Dharma, you know, all these different things. Where are we going? What are we doing with this? And I said, do you really think that the way of spreading Krishna consciousness is just to turn over lots of people, send them all out on vans and traveling Sankirtan? Is this what spreading Krishna consciousness is all about? The movement? Is this all it is? You know, I mean, I said, look, I joined when I was 17. I was in my early 20s at this time. I'm going somewhere with my life, with my journey. You know, we've all got to be kind of like going through it. And when we had this story, when he talked to me, I'd never said all this stuff. He'd most probably never heard a conversation like this with anybody. And I realized during this conversation, I don't want to blow my own horn, but I will, that I knew more than he did. I felt if they'd asked me to be in charge of the ISKCON or my GBC, I could have actually had intelligent conversations, brought out things. We could have worked as a group. I could see all sorts of ways we could have done things, but no, it had all become this club, 11 guys, 11 zones, 11 things. We are in charge. Everything got fragmented and a very limited view about spreading Krishna consciousness. And he again, after we had the conversation, he tried to convince Gopal Krishna to be more, he said, Mathura is very helpful. He can do this and do that. And Gopal Krishna said, he's got to wear saffron cloth. He's got to shave his head. He's got to chant his japa in the temple. I said, you know, I'm not a Boy Scout anymore. I've gone beyond that, you know. And I actually said, look, he's not interested. No one's in, you know, I'm out of here. And so I had a talk with Bhagavan and I said, I'm going to leave. I didn't know what was going to happen. And he was kind of shocked that I was just so convinced and prepared to make that big leap because I was quite young. And you know, he apologized and he said, I'm very sorry that ISKCON is not mature enough to be able to incorporate people like you. And he said that, but the irony of it was, you know, I didn't say it, but the door closed, and that was the end of the chapter. My book really is basically, you are ISKCON. You could have done something, but you didn't. A lot of people claim victim mentality. Oh, it wasn't, you know, Prabhupada did it. It wasn't me. A lot of people blame Prabhupada for loads and loads of things, you know, when actually a lot of it was just due to a way of not working together. So what happened to me is I went back to England, first of all worked in the restaurant, and then went through this kind of, I call it, all those years you're in what's called a hypnotic bubble. It's very hermetically sealed. You live in that world. And of course, as I got more and more independent, it got less and less and less. But then suddenly you're in England and you're not in it anymore. There's no GBC. You're not got any project. You're not under anybody. You're just this weird free agent. And so there's a long story of my life. I was one of the very first fringes in England. They called them fringes, in those days. You see, it was a very, if you were either in or out. So we're talking about now circa 1980. We've just got to the beginning of 1980. And then, so I'm a kind of early fringy, but my life goes on and on into all these incredible experiences, basically. And maybe we do have to have another talk if we want to talk about them.
I think we're going to have to do a part 2 at some point, because I want to talk a bit about your book and your music and what you're doing today. You've kind of summed up for the first 24 years of your life in 2 hours, but we've still got 42 years to go from 1980. So I think what I'd really love to do at some point is to do another part 2, basically. That would be really, really good. And we certainly, after we've said goodbye to everybody, we can arrange a date and a time for all of that. But I've been fascinated by your story so far up to 1980. Some of we've mentioned the Carry On films, Henry VIII. We've mentioned LSD. We've mentioned Amsterdam. What else did we mention? You drove through Iran during the Iranian Revolution. You discovered Radhadesh. You were there at the time that Srila Prabhupada left the world. So you're quite an amazing devotee.
Well, look, in a nutshell, before, it's just that what I wanted to say was that when you go out of that bubble, or when anybody does, and you suddenly had all this training in this institution, which is the Hare Krishna movement institution, the whole story in chapter changes. So what happens is all of that stuff that you've been learning all those years, those Bhagavad Gita classes, Bhagavatam classes, the talks, the lectures, the philosophies, it's like, that was student time. Now it's real. Now you've got to go out into the big wide world and see how that, the relevance of what that means to you as an individual. That's why I said, and so that Krishna consciousness of being conscious of Krishna, you suddenly realize, that fear of people, of leaving you, it's like falling off the edge of the world. Oh, if you go out there, you'll get eaten up and this. No, it's not. Something else just goes on, but it's a whole nother story, because
it is a bubble, and a lot of religious organizations and institutions have that bubble.
Yes.
The Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons would be other examples, but certainly, ISKCON is a bubble, and there is life outside of that bubble. A lot of us have experienced that.
So because you've told me a bit about your story. You've come to Krishna through a very different story than myself.
I was never a hippie. I never did drugs.
Also, you're not a full-time ashramite. You've got a job, you've got things going on. You're in the world, but you're in Krishna. So, the whole world, for the story that I've told is about once upon a time, the world looked like that if you were part of the Krishna movement, and then everything changed. And I told you, I've explained the transition point for many devotees was that many people stayed on and did stuff, but I was one of the kind of, you could say, pioneers of going it alone and just seeing what was outside of that bubble.
A real maverick.
And here I am to tell my story.
I love mavericks. I'm a bit of a maverick myself. So we can certainly chat after we've said goodbye to everybody, but I've really loved having you on what is now, part 1 of this. It's been fascinating, really fascinating to hear your story. I certainly didn't know before I invited you, you were there when Prabhupada left. And I hope that lots of people will watch this podcast, because it's a really important one. And I'm very keen for devotees, those of us that would still say that we're in the ISKCON family or bubble. It's really important that we can be self-critical. Sometimes people find it difficult to criticize themselves or the institution they're part of. The Church of England, so to speak, for all of its faults, some of the people I know in the Church of England now, they've also been some of the biggest critics of the Church of England, but they've stayed in it because they want to see it be better and they want to see it do different things. And I think it's important that those of us that would still say that we're in ISKCON feel comfortable being critical about how things are done and how we can make things better. I've quite comfortably actually positioned myself on the liberal wing of the movement. I don't feel quite comfortable calling myself a liberal. That means different things to different people, but yeah, I think that's important. Mathura Prabhu, sorry, you were going to say something.
Just one thing. I wanted to distinguish between ISKCON and the Krishna movement.
Okay.
Now, you've written a book about the Krishna movement in England. How many different branches did you say that you've discovered?
In the Sarasvat line, there's around 20.
So you see, but there wasn't, and if you go back to where I'm talking about, there was none. There was only one, ISKCON.
Yes.
So this is everything that you use in your book has manifested, except for the original one from Bon Maharaj.
Yeah, the Gaudiya mission, which was from 33, but there was only really 2 mats in the UK up to 1982.
Right.
It was only 2 mats.
So basically, I've described a historical thing that's happened up to that. Now, there's the ISKCON institution has gone through its changes and has a story. But what has happened is that it's ceded the apostasy, you could say, from the ISKCON in various ways to different mats or independent freelance. It's interesting because there's this parallel thing of the Krishna movement. There's a difference between a movement and an institution. I like to make a point about that. But, even if
is it moving? That's another discussion.
Oh, it definitely is.
Is it moving? What does it look like?
Here and where I am, I'm having regular Bhagavad Gita sessions with Madan. We all kind of, it's south, near where you live. South,
yeah.
It's going on. But it's got nothing to do with an institution. Absolutely nothing. And Krishna consciousness, actually, Prabhupada set up the institution, but it's actually Krishna consciousness is totally independent from any kind of group or movement. It's between you and God. It's a relationship between you and Krishna. That's what I would like to say of my final words.
That's a great way to end, actually, our own personal relationship with the divine, with God, with Krishna. So thank you, Mathura Prabhu, for your first appearance on the Hare Krishnas in Britain podcast. You will be back soon to chat about what you've been up to recently with your music, your YouTube channel, and your book that I'm looking forward to reading. I shall set aside maybe a long holiday to go off and read it. Thank you to everyone who's tuned into this podcast to hear the first part of Mathura Prabhu's story. If you're watching this on YouTube, please do put a supportive comment. Please do like it. Please do share the link. If you're watching this on Facebook, please do like it, love it, or care for it. Hopefully you're not angry about it. But of course, we're living in a democracy, thankfully, so you can have your own opinion. And please put a positive comment and listen. If you've missed any parts of this podcast, please do rewind it and look at it, and share the Hare Krishna Project page. We're keen to hear from devotees all over the UK. And of course, if you haven't bought my book, which Mathura Prabhu alluded to, it's on Amazon. You can buy it in paperback or on Kindle. The Hare Krishnas in Britain looks at the Hare Krishna movement in the UK kind of from today right back to 1933, not 1968. There's another 35 years before that, which not a lot of people know about, which is mentioned in this book. So
which is one of the reasons I wanted to come on this podcast, because I'm very interested in what you're doing, the historical process. It's very important. And my kind of story is a kind of a part of being a chronicler of the story, as well as telling my story. It's a chronicle of a group and a movement, and it's a record of how things have been.
And you're a big part, I can assure you, of the Krishna story in the UK.
We all have got our amazing, we're all links in a chain. But it's fantastic. Thank you to everybody out there who's taken the time to listen to this video, and thanks to Narada for providing this podcast a platform for talking about these things and sharing things. And I've got lots of things to say, and hopefully we will put links to my
link to your series of
everything, 26 videos that
anything you want to put a link to, as long as it's appropriate and relevant. We'll put a link to it.
Fantastic.
And so we'll just say goodbye to the guests watching, and you and I can chat about them after. Okay, Hare Krishna, everyone. Take care. Bye.